The day began under a heavy grey sky in Santiago on September 11, 1973. At around 8 a.m., the radio broadcasts began reporting a significant military movement. Salvador Allende, the democratically elected socialist president, arrived at La Moneda, the presidential palace, with his security detail. Within the palace, he was joined by a small group of loyal staff, including personal doctors, security personnel, and a handful of ministers. A little before 10 a.m., army tanks arrived in the Plaza de la Constitución and took up positions in front of La Moneda. To the supporters of Allende, this seemed like the military had come to stand in defense of the government. They watched as the tank turrets slowly swiveled and aimed at the presidential palace. At 10 a.m., the tanks opened fire. From the air, Hawker Hunter jets swooped down and fired missiles and rockets at the palace. Inside, there was chaos. As smoke filled the burning building, Allende walked into the Salón de la Independencia. Dr. Patricio Quijon, the last person to see him alive, later recalled that as Allende entered the room, he yelled, "Allende does not surrender to military bastards." On a sofa in the hall, the president shot himself with his rifle. As the afternoon wore on, the first fire crews arrived to fight the blaze. The situation was total chaos. Soldiers surrounded the building, orders were shouted, and gunfire echoed through the streets. The military, now under the command of General Augusto Pinochet, dissolved the Congress and imposed a strict curfew. This was not a random outbreak of violence, but a carefully executed takeover. And thousands of miles away, in a quiet university office in Chicago, a group of economists were watching the chaos unfold with great interest, because they understood something that most people didn't. To understand why they were watching and what they planned to do with the chaos, we have to go back to a lecture hall and a theory that would change the world forever. The Chicago Boys were a group of young Chilean economists who had trained at the University of Chicago under Milton Friedman and Arnold Harberger. They were the product of a program set up by the US State Department in 1955 to counter Soviet influence in Latin America, an agreement that sent Chilean students to study at the epicenter of free market theory. Only about 100 Chileans participated in the program from 1957 to 1970. They returned to Chile with a radical vision that was completely alien to the country's political mainstream. At the time, Chilean economic thinking was dominated by Keynesianism and structuralism, the idea that the state should play a central role in the economy. The Chicago Boys' ideas were considered fringe, and they were written off as extremists. In 1970, they compiled their ideas into a 500-page document. It was a complete blueprint for restructuring the Chilean economy, privatizing state enterprises, liberalizing trade, eliminating price controls, and slashing government spending. It was a massive, dense document. The mimeographed copies were so thick and heavy that people started calling it El Ladrillo, meaning the brick. They presented it to Jorge Alessandri, a conservative candidate in the 1970 presidential election, but he rejected it. The document sat on a shelf, almost forgotten. The coup changed everything. Suddenly, the men with guns were in power. And the men with guns had no idea what to do with the economy. But the Chicago Boys had a 500-page plan ready. They had been preparing for this moment for years. Within weeks of the coup, the Chicago Boys stepped into key government positions. With Sergio de Castro at the Ministry of Finance, Pablo Barahona heading the Ministry of Economy, and Jorge Coas leading the central bank, the group finally dusted off the brick and began bringing its radical blueprint to life. The Chicago Boys knew their radical reforms would never survive a functioning democracy. They needed a population too disoriented to resist. The coup provided the chaos birthed the opportunity, and that opportunity was ruthlessly exploited. Welcome to the ultimate playbook of crisis capitalism. What you have just witnessed is the definitive real-world case study of the Shock Doctrine. The Shock Doctrine is the political and economic strategy of using large-scale crises such as natural disasters, wars, economic collapses, or political coups to forcefully push through radical, pro-corporate free market reforms while the public is too disoriented and traumatized to resist. It reveals a deeply cynical view of human agency, suggesting that radical political and economic transformations cannot successfully rely on democratic consensus, but must instead weaponize human vulnerability. By capitalizing on moments of collective trauma, practitioners of this strategy essentially treat a population's disorientation as a blank slate upon which new systems can be forcibly written. This approach exploits a profound flaw in human psychology. When individuals are consumed by immediate survival and grief, their capacity for long-term political resistance and critical scrutiny evaporates. Consequently, the strategy shifts the true arena of historical change away from public debate and into the realm of opportunistic crisis management, where the emergency itself serves as a smokescreen for engineered inequality. Instead of a crisis triggering a protective state response focused on collective healing, the shock doctrine transforms the state into a vehicle for rapid corporate enrichment. This creates a deeply destabilizing precedent where disasters are no longer viewed as tragedies to be prevented or mitigated, but as highly lucrative market opportunities to be anticipated. Over time, this erodes the foundational trust required for democratic societies to function, replacing public solidarity with a pervasive sense of powerlessness and atomization, as the mechanisms of social support are dismantled precisely when people need them most. Thinkers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued that governments derive their legitimate authority from the consent of the governed. Citizens willingly surrender certain freedoms to the state in exchange for protection and the preservation of the public good. The shock doctrine flips this contract upside down. Instead of protecting citizens during a crisis, the state exploits their vulnerability to strip away public assets and social safety nets. Because these radical changes are enacted when the population is incapable of giving informed consent, the resulting policies lack democratic legitimacy. Political decisions are only legitimate if they emerge from open, rational, and public debate. The shock doctrine deliberately bypasses this process. It relies on speed, secrecy, and administrative fiat to pass laws before the public can organize, debate, or vote. It replaces the democratic ideal of persuasion with the authoritarian mechanic of overwhelming. Immanuel Kant's fundamental ethical principle states that human beings must always be treated as ends in themselves, never merely as a means to an end. Using a community's grief, displacement, or terror as a political crowbar to force economic restructuring reduces human suffering to a mere tool for corporate enrichment. In modern economic environment, major corporations exploit global supply chain disruptions and inflation anxiety to mask aggressive price hikes. By convincing the public that rising costs are an inevitable result of external crises, they artificially expand their profit margins to historic highs, capitalizing on public confusion to extract wealth. The system doesn't need to invent the chaos, it just waits for it. Because when a shock hits and the world looks away in fear, that is when the rules are rewritten, public wealth vanishes and the trap snaps shut. The panic always wears off, but the changes they push through are permanent.